April 8, 1943. 27,000 feet above Abbeville, France. Oberleutnant Joseph "Pips" Priller adjusted his oxygen mask and smiled as he watched the ungainly silhouettes climbing laboriously toward his formation. Through the crystal-clear canopy of his Focke Wulf 190A5, he could see them clearly. 16 massive Republic P-47 Thunderbolts struggling for altitude like overloaded cargo planes. "The Americans have sent us flying refrigerators," he transmitted to his wingman, unable to suppress his laughter. "Look at them. Fat, slow, helpless." Below them, the 56th Fighter Group was making its combat debut over occupied Europe. Major Hubert Zemke led 16 P-47C Thunderbolts in tight formation, their 2,000 horsepower Pratt Whitney engines straining against 7 tons of weight. To German pilots accustomed to sleek Messerschmitts and nimble Focke Wulfs, these corpulent American machines looked almost comical. Barrel-shaped fuselages topped with bubble canopies, wings that seemed too small for their massive bodies, propellers that dwarfed anything in the Luftwaffe inventory. Everything about them screamed target. What Priller didn't know, what none of the 30 German pilots circling like wolves above could have imagined, was that they were witnessing the arrival of the weapon that would systematically destroy the Luftwaffe's fighter arm over the next 2 years. Within 18 months, these flying refrigerators would transform from objects of derision into instruments of terror. Their .850 caliber Browning machine guns would become the most feared sound in German skies. The mathematics of destruction were already loaded in those broad wings. 3,400 rounds of ammunition, a combined rate of fire of 6,400 rounds per minute, enough concentrated firepower to saw a Messerschmitt in half in less than 2 seconds. The transformation began that April morning, and it would be written in the wreckage of German fighters scattered across the fields of France. June 1940. Farmingdale, Long Island, New York. Alexander Kartveli sat at his drafting table, staring at specifications that seemed impossible to meet. The Georgian-born chief designer of Republic Aviation had just received urgent requirements from the U.S. Army Air Corps. They wanted a high-altitude interceptor capable of matching anything the Luftwaffe could produce. What Kartveli designed instead was something that redefined what a fighter aircraft could be. "It will be enormous," Kartveli admitted to his engineering team. "It will be heavy. Critics will say it's too big to be a fighter, but if we do this correctly, it will be unstoppable." The XP-47B prototype that first flew on May 6, 1941, shocked everyone who saw it. At 9,900 pounds empty, it weighed 65% more than its predecessor, the P-43 Lancer. At 12,500 pounds loaded, it weighed as much as some medium bombers. The massive turbo-supercharger system, with its complex ducting running through the rear fuselage, gave it an almost pregnant appearance. The cockpit sat so high that ground crews needed ladders to reach it. Test pilots approaching it for the first time invariably asked the same question: "This thing actually flies?" Not only did it fly, it flew like nothing else at altitude. The Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine was an 18-cylinder radial masterpiece producing 2,000 horsepower. But the real magic was the turbo-supercharger. Driven by exhaust gases, it could maintain full power at 30,000 feet, where German fighters gasped for air. At altitudes where Messerschmitts and Focke Wulfs became sluggish and unresponsive, the Thunderbolt was just reaching peak performance. The armament reflected American philosophy: overwhelming firepower. 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. Total ammunition capacity 3,400 rounds. Each gun fired 800 rounds per minute. Together, they could put 107 half-inch bullets into a target area every second. But the early test results were terrifying for all the wrong reasons. Major Hubert "Hub" Zemke, assigned to command the 56th Fighter Group and train pilots on the new aircraft, initially despised it. Between September 1942 and January 1943, his unit lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training accidents. The P-47 was killing more Americans in training than Germans would kill in the first months of combat. It ground-looped on landing, snapping landing gear like toothpicks. It torque-rolled on takeoff, flipping inverted before pilots could react. And worst of all, it dove with such enthusiasm that pilots discovered a terrifying phenomenon called compressibility Their controls would freeze as shockwaves formed on the wings, the aircraft plummeting toward Earth while pilots pulled helplessly on immovable control sticks. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma who would become one of America's top aces, described his first flight. "I thought it would kill me. The power was unbelievable. You didn't fly it so much as aim it and hold on, but once you understood what it could do, once you learned to work with it, instead of against it, you realized you were sitting in something special." Those who mastered the Thunderbolt discovered an aircraft unlike anything else in the sky. In a dive from altitude, nothing could catch it. The P-47 could reach 550 miles per hour in a near-vertical dive, faster than any German fighter could achieve, even with gravity helping. That speed could be converted into altitude through zoom climbs that defied physics. Dive on an enemy, fire, then pull back on the stick and watch the airspeed bleed off as you rocketed back to 30,000 feet while your opponent watched helplessly from below. But all of that potential meant nothing if German pilots didn't take the bait. And in April 1943, as the first Thunderbolts crossed into occupied France, the Luftwaffe was more than ready to oblige. April 15, 1943, over Saint-Omer, France. The 4th Fighter Group, formerly RAF Eagle Squadron pilots who'd flown Spitfires, encountered Focke Wulf 190s for the first time in their new Thunderbolts. What followed was a disaster that confirmed every German prejudice. The German pilots used tactics perfected over 4 years of war. Attack from below, where the heavy Thunderbolts were sluggish. Force-turning fights, where agility mattered more than firepower. And pick off stragglers who couldn't keep up with formation. In the first 30 seconds, 2 P-47s went down in flames. The German pilots were astonished at how easily the big American fighters died once they could get guns on them. Hauptmann Walter Gulla-Usau, an ace with 123 victories, transmitted to his squadron. "They're even easier than Spitfires? Heavy, slow, can't turn. My grandmother could shoot these down." The Americans lost 5 Thunderbolts that day. They claimed 2 German aircraft destroyed, but post-war analysis suggested the actual number was 0. The Luftwaffe pilots returned to base laughing. The Americans had brought them target practice in airplane form. The statistics from April and May 1943 seemed to confirm German confidence. In their first month of operations, American fighter groups lost 14 Thunderbolts in combat for only 3 confirmed German kills. The RAF, observing from their Spitfire squadrons, quietly suggested the Americans might want to reconsider their choice of mount. British pilots joked that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was to unbuckle your harness and run around the roomy cockpit until the German ran out of ammunition. German intelligence officers compiled reports on the new American fighter. Their assessment, distributed to all Jagdgeschwader units, was dismissive. The P-47 Thunderbolt represents typical American excess. Large, heavy, overbuilt, and fundamentally unsuited to air combat. Our pilots should find them profitable targets. But something strange was happening in those early encounters, something German intelligence failed to notice or understand. The Thunderbolts that were shot down had absorbed incredible punishment before falling. One aircraft returned from a mission on May 4th with 21 cannon holes and over 100 machine gun strikes, damage that would have disintegrated a Messerschmitt or even a Spitfire. The massive radial engine, lacking vulnerable coolant systems, shrugged off hits that would have stopped a liquid-cooled fighter immediately. Lieutenant Robert Johnson was learning the Thunderbolt's real capabilities through trial and terror. The first few missions, we tried to fight like the RAF taught us. Turn and burn, get on their tails, classical dogfighting. We got massacred. The P-47 won't dogfight. It's not built for that. But in June, some of us started figuring out what it was built for. June 26, 1943, would prove to be the day that changed everything. The day that German mockery began its transformation into fear. June 26, 1943, over Le Havre, France. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron was flying tail end Charlie, the most vulnerable position in the formation. When 16 Focke-Wulf 190s from Jagdgeschwader 26 bounced his group. The German attack was textbook perfect, diving from the sun with overwhelming speed advantage. Johnson's Thunderbolt was caught in the crossfire of multiple attackers within seconds. 20-20mm cannon shells exploded across his aircraft. The canopy shattered, spraying plexiglass fragments into his face. Hydraulic fluid erupted from severed lines coating the cockpit. The engine cowling was torn away. Fire bloomed behind the instrument panel. Johnson, wounded by shrapnel in the face and legs, tried to bail out. The canopy was jammed. A 20mm shell had exploded in the canopy track, welding it shut. He was trapped in a dying aircraft at 27,000 feet. What happened next would become legend on both sides of the conflict. Despite having no forward visibility through the oil-covered windscreen, despite an engine that shook violently and threatened to tear itself from its mounts, despite control surfaces that barely responded, Johnson managed to level the aircraft and point it toward England. The P-47 continued flying. Damage that should have reduced any other fighter to falling debris somehow held together. Then it got worse. A lone Focke Wulf 190, flown by an unidentified pilot from JG-26, discovered the crippled Thunderbolt limping toward the channel at less than 170 miles per hour. Historical research has never definitively identified this German pilot, though several names have been proposed based on German combat reports. The German positioned himself behind Johnson's aircraft and opened fire with his 4 20mm cannon and 2 13mm machine guns. Johnson could only huddle behind his armor plate and pray while his aircraft absorbed the entire ammunition load. 20 more cannon shells, 60 machine gun rounds, all fired at point-blank range into an aircraft that should have disintegrated. The Thunderbolt kept flying. The German pilot pulled alongside, close enough that Johnson could see his face clearly. Young, blonde, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion to something approaching disbelief. The German repositioned and fired again, this time with only machine guns, his cannon ammunition exhausted. Still, the Thunderbolt flew. The German pulled alongside again, stared at the flying wreck in apparent amazement, gave what Johnson later described as a respectful salute, and peeled away. Out of ammunition, out of understanding, out of answers. Johnson's P-47 crossed the English Channel at 200 feet. The engine finally beginning its death throes, he crash-landed at RAF Manston, with the engine seizing as the propeller stopped turning on the runway. The ground crew chief stopped counting damage after reaching 200 holes. One cannon shell had exploded inches from Johnson's head, stopped by armor plating. Another had detonated against the armor plate behind his seat. The engine had taken direct hits. Control cables were partially severed. 3 of the 4 main longerons, the structural backbone of the fuselage, were shot through. Yet the aircraft had brought him home across 150 miles of occupied France and the English Channel. The survival of Johnson's aircraft sent shockwaves through both air forces. American engineers studying the wreckage realized they had built something even tougher than designed. German intelligence, receiving reports from JG-26, initially refused to believe them. No aircraft could absorb that much damage. Multiple German pilots testified to the impossible. The Thunderbolt had taken everything the Luftwaffe's best fighter could deliver and survived. The story spread through both air forces within days. For Americans, it proved their aircraft was tougher than they dared hope. For Germans, it was the first hint that the flying refrigerator might be more dangerous than it looked. July 1943, RAF Horsham St. Faith, England. Major Hubert Zemke called his squadron commanders together for a meeting that would revolutionize American fighter tactics. On the blackboard behind him were casualty statistics that made uncomfortable reading. The 56th Fighter Group had lost 23 pilots in 3 months. They'd shot down 18 German aircraft, barely breaking even. "Gentlemen, we've been fighting their fight," Zemke announced. "We've been trying to turn with them, climb with them at low altitude, dogfight on their terms. That stops today. The P-47 doesn't win dogfights. It wins by refusing to dogfight." What Zemke had discovered through brutal trial and error would transform the Thunderbolt from target to terror. The secret was altitude and energy. The Thunderbolt's turbo-supercharger meant it could operate comfortably at 30,000 feet, where German fighters struggled. From that height, you could see everything below. You could choose when to fight, you could dictate terms. The tactic was simple but required discipline: patrol at 30,000 feet. When German fighters appeared below, roll inverted and dive. Accelerate to 450 miles per hour, faster than any German fighter could match. At that speed, deflection shooting was nearly impossible for defenders. Fire your 8 guns in a converging pattern that created a wall of bullets. Then, and this was the part that took discipline, don't follow them down into a turning fight. Use your speed to zoom climb back to altitude. Captain Walker Bud Mahoran, who would become one of the first American aces in Europe with 20 victories, all in the P-47, perfected what pilots called boom and zoom. You don't chase them, Mahurin explained. You set up the geometry so they have to come through your kill zone. Height equals might. Speed is life. The 850s equal death. That's the whole equation. By August 1943, American pilots were beginning to understand their aircraft's true potential. The Thunderbolt couldn't turn inside a Focke Wulf 190 or Messerschmitt 109, but it could dive faster than they could follow, climb higher than they could reach, and when those 8 guns spoke, German aircraft didn't just fall, they disintegrated. The ammunition itself was designed for destruction. Standard combat loads mixed armor-piercing incendiary tracer, and ball ammunition. The API rounds would penetrate armor and structure, then detonate inside. The tracers allowed pilots to walk fire onto target. At convergence distance, typically set at 300 yards, all 8 guns. Ballistic trajectories intersected in a killing zone, roughly 6 feet in diameter. Anything in that zone faced 107 half-inch projectiles per second. Each bullet weighed 1.7 ounces and traveled at 2,900 feet per second. The kinetic energy was devastating. Aircraft caught in full burst didn't gradually fail, they exploded. Wings separated, fuselages broke in half. Pilots died without understanding what hit them. August 17, 1943, the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. The deepest penetration into Germany attempted to date. B-17 bombers targeting ball-bearing factories and Messerschmitt production. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had at the bombers, including Messerschmitt, 110 Zerstorer, destroyer, twin-engine heavy fighters armed with rockets and cannon. Major David Schilling, leading the 62nd Fighter Squadron, intercepted a formation of Me-110s positioning to attack the B-17s from 28,000 feet. His flight of 4 Thunderbolts rolled inverted and dove. Unteroffizier Heinrich Roth, a gunner in one of the Me-110 Zeros, survived the attack and was interrogated as a POW. His testimony was recorded. The American fighters came down like falling anvils. I opened fire at 800 meters. Good hits. I saw strikes on the leader's wing. He didn't even wobble. Then he fired. The aircraft ahead of us simply ceased to exist. Not shot down, destroyed. Wings separated. Tail severed. The crew compartment shredded into aluminum confetti. In less than 2 seconds, a 110 weighing 7 tons became debris falling in pieces. Schilling's flight destroyed 8 Me-110s and 2 Me-19s in less than 90 seconds. German pilots had never experienced such concentrated firepower. The Luftwaffe had been fighting Spitfires with 8 303 caliber machine guns, rifle caliber weapons that required sustained fire to down aircraft. They'd encountered American P-38s with 120mm cannon and 4.50 caliber guns. Dangerous but limited ammunition. The P-47's 50 calibers with 3,400 rounds total created something entirely new, sustained. Hurricane force firepower that could destroy multiple targets without reloading. September 1943, Luftwaffe headquarters, East Prussia. Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering read the combat loss reports with growing alarm. Jagdgeschwader units were reporting something disturbing. The P-47 Thunderbolt, initially dismissed as easy prey, was now achieving kill ratios approaching 3-to-1 in its favor. He demanded an assessment from his technical intelligence branch. The report delivered in October 1943 made uncomfortable reading. The P-47 Thunderbolt exceeds all previous estimates. Service ceiling 43,000 feet higher than any German fighter can reach. Dive speed 550 miles per hour, approaching sound barrier. Armor protection extensive, including 3/8-inch steel plate behind pilot, bulletproof glass, armored engine compartment. Armament 8. 50 caliber machine guns with 3,400 rounds, sustained firepower unprecedented in single-engine fighters. Most concerning, structural strength allows maneuvers that would destroy German fighters. American pilots report pulling 7G maneuvers routinely. Our fighters are limited to 5G maximum. The conclusion was devastating. The Thunderbolt represents a fundamental shift in fighter design philosophy. Where we prioritized agility and speed, Americans prioritize firepower and survivability. In extended air combat, their philosophy is proving superior. German pilots were learning this lesson in blood and wreckage. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, one of Germany's top aces with 206 victories, encountered the new reality on October 8, 1943. Leading Jagdgeschwader 1 against B-17s at 28,000 feet over Bremen, Philipp found his Focke Wulf 190A6 sluggish in the thin air. The BMW 801 engine, powerful at medium altitudes, was gasping for oxygen nearly 6 miles above the Earth. When P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group dove on his formation from 32,000 feet, the German fighters couldn't respond effectively. The Thunderbolts had altitude advantage, speed advantage, and position advantage. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, the same pilot who'd survived the 26th of June massacre, was flying at 31,000 feet when he spotted Philipp's distinctive Focke Wulf. Johnson's combat report was clinical. Opened fire at 300 yards, 30-degree deflection. Observed strikes along entire fuselage and wing route. Enemy aircraft exploded. Large pieces separated. No parachute observed. Hans Philipp, a Knight's Cross holder who had survived over 500 combat missions on both Eastern and Western fronts, was dead. If one of Germany's best couldn't survive against Thunderbolts, what hope did average pilots have? The answer was very little. By November 1943, Luftwaffe pilots had developed what their commanders called Thunderbolt fever, the same psychological condition that Allied pilots had experienced with Zero fever in the Pacific. Physical symptoms of stress appeared when P-47s were reported in the area. Veterans who had faced Spitfires and Hurricanes without flinching became anxious before missions where Thunderbolts were expected. The sound was part of it. The P-47's massive propeller, 12 feet 2 inches in diameter, created a distinctive deep thunder that could be heard from miles away. German ground troops reported being able to identify approaching Thunderbolts by sound alone, a threatening rumble that meant death from above. They began calling it Donnerschlag, thunderclap. The name was apt. When 8.50 caliber guns opened fire, it sounded like thunder. When they hit, it looked like lightning strikes. Absolutely, I can do that perfectly. January 1944. Republic Aviation Factory, Farmingdale, New York. Engineers had been working on the P-47's one remaining weakness, climb rate. At sea level, early Thunderbolts climbed at only 2,200 feet per minute, significantly worse than German fighters. This gave the Luftwaffe brief windows of vulnerability during takeoff and initial climb. The solution was elegantly simple: a better propeller. The Hamilton Standard hydromatic propeller with paddle blades, 13 feet in diameter, with broad chord blades that bit into thin air like massive oars, transformed the Thunderbolt's performance. The P-47D-22 variant with the new propeller began reaching England in January 1944. The improvement was immediate and dramatic. Climb rate jumped to 3,000 feet per minute, matching or exceeding German fighters at most altitudes. More importantly, acceleration improved dramatically. The massive propeller transformed engine power into thrust more efficiently, allowing Thunderbolts to build energy faster in level flight. Hauptmann Heinz Nacke of Jagdgeschwader 11, a veteran with over 200 combat missions, encountered the paddle blade variants in February 1944 near Hanover. His combat diary entry revealed German dismay. "The fat American fighters have learned to climb. We attempted standard attack from below, expecting our usual advantage. They turned into us and matched our climb rate. When we tried to disengage, they followed us to 30,000 feet. Schmidt was caught by one and literally blown apart. Nothing left but smoke and fragments. These are not the same machines we laughed at last year." The paddle blade propeller did more than improve performance. It changed the Thunderbolt's sound. The blade tips reached transonic speeds, creating a distinctive roar that could be heard for miles. The psychological effect was significant. German troops reported the sound-induced fear responses before the aircraft were even visible. By March 1944, P-47s equipped with external fuel tanks could escort bombers deep into Germany. The standard configuration carried two 108-gallon wing tanks or a single 75-gallon belly tank extending range beyond 1,000 miles. with the paddle blade propeller providing improved performance even when heavily loaded. Thunderbolts could fight effectively immediately after dropping external tanks. The Luftwaffe's last hope that American fighters would run out of fuel before reaching critical targets evaporated. Thunderbolts were now appearing over Berlin, Munich, Vienna. Nowhere was safe. March 6, 1944, over Stuttgart, Germany. Major Gerald Johnson, commanding the 61st Fighter Squadron, led his Thunderbolts into what would become one of the war's most one-sided air battles. The German defenders were experienced pilots from Jagdgeschwader 53, veterans of the Eastern Front recently transferred west. They expected to use their Russian front tactics: aggressive attacks from multiple angles, high-speed passes, then disengagement before American fighters could respond. They discovered too late that Thunderbolt pilots had evolved far beyond the nervous rookies of 1943. The engagement began at 28,000 feet. 30 Messerschmitt 109 G6s attempted to intercept B-17s. 16 P-47s dove on them from 32,000 feet. What followed lasted 6 minutes and resulted in 18 German fighters destroyed, for 0 American losses. The Americans had perfected team tactics. Flights of 4 aircraft worked together, 2 engaged while 2 covered from above. When German pilots tried to attack the engaged pair, the top cover dove on them. When they tried to escape, the engaged pair pursued while fresh fighters took the top cover position. It was methodical, mechanical, deadly. Lieutenant Quince Brown, who would finish the war with 12 victories, described the engagement. It wasn't like fighting anymore. It was like processing. We'd put one through the kill zone, he'd come apart. Next one. Repeat. The 850s didn't give them time to react. First burst, and they were done. Fire. Explosion. Pieces falling. We went through 18 of them like an assembly line. The gun camera footage from that mission was used for training. It showed Messerschmitts attempting to turn and climb, traditional fighter maneuvers, only to be torn apart by concentrated .50 caliber fire. The footage was clinically horrifying. Aircraft didn't gradually deteriorate, they exploded into component parts. By April 1944, American fighter pilots arriving in Europe with 300+ hours of training were facing German pilots with less than 100 hours total flight time. The Luftwaffe's experienced pilots were dead. The replacements were children, sent to die in obsolescent aircraft against an enemy that owned the sky. The statistics told a story of systematic slaughter. April 1944 air combat results. German fighters destroyed, 442. American fighters lost in air combat, 47. Kill ratio, 9.4 to 1. The Thunderbolt was responsible for approximately 60% of American victories, despite representing only 40% of fighter strength. As P-51 Mustangs arrived to take over long-range escort duties in spring 1944, Thunderbolts increasingly focused on ground attack, a role that would make them the most feared aircraft in the German arsenal. The P-47's rugged construction, designed to survive air combat damage, proved equally effective against ground fire. The massive radial engine could absorb 20mm cannon hits and keep running. The armor protected pilots from ground fire that would have killed pilots in liquid-cooled fighters. But it was the addition of bombs and rockets that transformed the Thunderbolt into a true multi-role monster. The D-25 variant could carry 2 1,000-pound bombs under the wings and a 500-pounder under the fuselage, a bomb load equal to early war medium bombers. Later variants added zero-length rocket stubs for 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, HVARs, each equivalent to a 105mm artillery shell, combined with 8.50 caliber machine guns that could shred trucks, trains, and light armor. The P-47 became the most effective ground attack aircraft of the Western Front. Oberstleutnant Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzergrenadier Regiment during the Normandy campaign, experienced P-47 ground attacks firsthand. His memoir described the horror. They came in low, so low you could see the pilots' faces. The sound was terrifying even before they fired. Engines roaring, rockets screaming off the rails, then the hammer of those 8 machine guns. A column of 20 trucks simply ceased to exist in one pass, transformed into burning wreckage in seconds. The psychological effect was devastating. My men called them jabos, fighter bombers. But these were beyond that. They were flying artillery with sniper accuracy. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Over 500 P-47s provided air cover for the invasion, creating an impenetrable umbrella over the beaches. The Luftwaffe managed only sporadic appearances. German fighters attempting to reach the landing zones were massacred. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer of Jagdgeschwader II, one of only 3 German pilots to reach the beaches that day, reported, "The sky belonged entirely to them. Thunderbolts were stacked from sea level to 30,000 feet. We tried to break through at dawn. 12 fighters from our Gruppe. I was the only one to return. The P-47s were waiting at every altitude. You couldn't climb over them, couldn't dive under them. Their guns turned our fighters into aluminum rain." In the weeks following D-Day, P-47 systematically destroyed German movement capability in daylight. The statistics were staggering. June 1944, 9th Air Force P-47 claims 651 locomotives destroyed, 3,847 trucks destroyed, 512 tanks and armored vehicles destroyed, 4,553 horse-drawn vehicles destroyed. The Wehrmacht was forced to move only at night, severely hampering their ability to respond to Allied advances. Behind the statistics were human beings whose lives ended in fire and terror on both sides. Unteroffizier Klaus Brettschneider, 19 years old, flew exactly 1 combat mission before being killed by P-47s over Leipzig. His Focke Wulf 190 was hit by 50 caliber fire and disintegrated. His mother received a brief letter. "Your son died serving the fatherland." She had no details, no explanation that her son had faced an opponent he was never trained to defeat. Feldwebel Otto Hartmann, 22 years old, survived being shot down 3 times before dying on his 4th mission when Thunderbolts caught his formation during takeoff. He never reached 1,000 feet. Hauptmann Werner Mulders, younger brother of the famous ace Werner Mulders, was killed when P-47 strafed his airfield. He died on the ground, never having a chance to fight. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 28,000 pilots killed in combat against Western Allied forces between 1943 and 1945. Many fell to concentrated 50 caliber fire from American fighters, predominantly P-47s. Each loss represented years of training Germany couldn't replace. American losses were significant but proportionally far lower. The 9th Air Force, predominantly equipped with P-47s, lost 1,697 aircraft in combat from D-Day to war's end. Most losses were to ground fire during low-altitude attack missions, not air combat. The P-47's armor and structural strength meant pilots shot down often survived. Lieutenant Francis Gabreski, who would become the top American ace in Europe with 28 victories, all in P-47s, was shot down by ground fire in July 1944. He survived and evaded capture for 5 days before being taken prisoner. He lived to return home after the war. Many Luftwaffe pilots weren't so fortunate. The light construction of German fighters meant they often disintegrated when hit. Pilots who did bail out faced capture in increasingly hostile territory as the Reich collapsed. By January 1945, the Luftwaffe existed largely on paper. Fuel shortages grounded most aircraft. Experienced pilots were dead or captured. Airfields were cratered ruins under constant attack. The Luftwaffe's desperate attempt to turn the tide came on January 1st, 1945. Operation Bodenplatte. Nearly 900 German fighters launched in surprise attacks on Allied airfields across Belgium and Holland. At Y-34 Airfield near Metz, home to the 365th Fighter Group's P-47s, German fighters destroyed 22 Thunderbolts on the ground along with several other aircraft. A captured German pilot brought to the command post pointed at the burning aircraft and taunted, "What do you think of that?" Major George Brooking's response became legendary throughout the 9th Air Force. He pointed to the flight line where ground crews were already pushing damaged aircraft aside and preparing hard stands for replacements. "By tomorrow, we'll have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" The German pilot's smirk disappeared. Within 48 hours, factory-fresh P-47s filled the flight line flown in from depots in England. The Luftwaffe lost 271 aircraft and 213 pilots in Bodenplatte, including many irreplaceable instructors and squadron leaders. These losses they could never replace. The Americans lost 134 aircraft total across all attacked airfields, all replaced within a week. The final P-47 kill occurred on May 7, 1945. Lieutenant Harold Rosser of the 362 Fighter Group shot down a Fieseler-Storch observation aircraft attempting to flee American lines. The next day, Germany surrendered. The P-47 Thunderbolt's combat record speaks for itself. Production: 15,683 aircraft built, more than any other American fighter. Aerial victories: 4,449 confirmed kills, 3,752 in Europe, 697 in the Pacific. Kill ratio: 4.6 to 1 in air combat. Ground destruction: Europe. 9,000 locomotives destroyed, and 86,000 railway cars destroyed. 68,000 trucks destroyed. 6,000 armored vehicles destroyed. Firepower delivered: it's 546,000 plus combat sorties flown, and 135 million rounds of .50 caliber fired, 132,000 tons of bombs dropped, 60,000 rockets launched. Pilot achievement: 127 American aces created flying P-47s, including nearly every top-scoring ace in Europe. The 9th Air Force alone flew 213,873 sorties in Thunderbolts, achieving the lowest loss rate of any Allied fighter bomber while destroying more enemy assets than any other aircraft type. No other fighter in history matched this combination of air superiority and ground attack dominance. September 1985, Lakenheath Royal Air Force Base, England. 40 years after the war ended, surviving German and American fighter pilots gathered for a reunion of former adversaries. The organizers had arranged for a restored P-47D Thunderbolt to be on display, polished aluminum gleaming in the autumn sun. Former General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, who had commanded the Luftwaffe's fighter arm from 1941 to 1945, stood before the aircraft for several minutes in silence. American veterans watched him, uncertain what to expect. Finally, he spoke. "We made a catastrophic error in 1943. We saw this aircraft and laughed. Too big, too heavy, too slow to turn. We said the Americans didn't understand fighter design, that they'd built a bomber and called it a fighter." He paused, running his hand along the massive cowling that housed the R-2800 engine. "We were the ones who didn't understand. The Americans weren't trying to build a European fighter. They built an American one, designed around different principles: production, firepower, survivability. We designed fighters for the pilots we had in 1939. Highly skilled artists who could exploit every advantage of a nimble aircraft. You designed fighters for the war you knew was coming, a long struggle where bringing pilots home mattered more than turn radius." Former Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, who had scored 176 victories before being horrifically burned in a crash landing, added his perspective. "The first time I encountered P-47s in early 1943, I thought we'd been sent a gift. Fat targets that couldn't maneuver. I shot one, put 20mm rounds into it at close range. It flew away. The pilot probably didn't even know I'd hit him. That was when I understood. This wasn't an aircraft. It was a flying tank that could fight back." Former Major Robert S. Johnson, the pilot who'd survived the 26th of June, 1943 attack, stood nearby. Steinhoff approached him, and through a translator, they spoke for the first time. "I read about your survival," Steinhoff said. "The aircraft that absorbed over 200 hits. I want you to know that story spread through the Luftwaffe within weeks. It destroyed morale more effectively than any propaganda. We realized we were fighting something we couldn't kill." Johnson nodded slowly. "That airplane brought me home when I should have died. But I want you to know something too. I never hated you guys. You were doing your job. We were doing ours. The P-47 just happened to be better at it." Former Hauptmann Heinz Nocke, who had written about the paddle-blade Thunderbolts in his diary, spoke to a group of American and German veterans. By 1944, hearing the sound of Thunderbolts approaching induced physical fear responses in our pilots, even veterans. That deep thunder of the big propeller meant death was coming. You couldn't hide from it, couldn't outrun it, couldn't kill it. The psychological dominance was total. He paused, struggling with emotion. "I lost 47 pilots from my Gruppe, most to American fighters, mostly P-47s. Boys, really, 18, 19 years old. Sent up with barely 100 hours of training against pilots who had 300 hours. In aircraft that couldn't protect them against guns that never seemed to miss. It wasn't war by the end. It was industrial-scale killing. Former Major Gerald Johnson, who had led the devastating March 6, 1944 battle over Stuttgart, responded quietly, "I never enjoyed it, none of us did. But you'd started a war that killed millions. We had to end it." The P-47 was the tool we were given, we used it. The discussion shifted to technical matters, a safer subject. German engineers in the group expressed grudging admiration for American design philosophy. The R-2800 engine was a masterpiece, admitted former Luftwaffe technical officer Hermann Goering, no relation to the Reichsmarshal. 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower, and it could run with half of them destroyed. Our liquid-cooled engines were more efficient, more elegant, but one coolant line cut and they stopped instantly. Your radial engines were crude but unstoppable. Former Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabby Gabreski, the top American ace in Europe with 28 victories, all in P-47s, offered his perspective. The Thunderbolt wasn't elegant, it was brutal, but that's what we needed. A fighter that could take punishment, deliver overwhelming firepower, and bring pilots home. I was shot down by ground fire, hit so bad I thought I was done. The aircraft crashed, but I walked away. Try doing that in a 109 or 190. One younger German in the audience, the son of a Luftwaffe pilot killed in 1944, asked the Americans a question that had haunted him. "How could you shoot down so many? My father flew 83 missions before he was killed by a P-47. He wrote letters saying the American pilots seemed to know where we would be before we got there. That they were always above us, always faster, always ready. How?" Former Lieutenant Quince Brown answered honestly, "Radar, we had ground controllers directing us to intercepts. You were flying blind. We had altitude because we could operate higher than you could effectively fight. We were faster in the dive because our aircraft were built stronger. And yes, we had more training. By 1944, American pilots had hundreds of hours. Your pilots had less than 100. It wasn't fair, but war never is." The reunion concluded with a ceremony at Cambridge American Cemetery, where 3,812 American airmen are buried. German veterans laid wreaths alongside American ones. Former enemies stood together in silence. Former Oberst Hannes Trautloft, who had commanded Jagdgeschwader 54 and survived the war with 58 victories, spoke at the ceremony. "We fought each other in the sky. Many of our friends died at each other's hands. But we were all young men doing what our countries asked of us. The P-47 pilots were brave and skilled. They deserved their victory. We deserved our defeat, not because we were cowards, but because we served an evil cause. The Thunderbolt didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe, it helped defeat Nazism. For that, the world should be grateful." The P-47 Thunderbolt retired from frontline U.S. service in 1955, replaced by jets. But its combat record remained unmatched for a single-engine fighter in terms of total destruction inflicted on an enemy. The aircraft served with foreign air forces into the 1960s. Peru operated P-47s until 1966. Bolivia flew them until 1967. Some were converted to civilian racers and still fly today at air shows, their massive radials thundering across modern skies. But the real legacy was what the P-47 represented, a philosophical approach to fighter, design that prioritized pilot survival and overwhelming firepower over dogfighting agility. Modern fighters, from the F-4 Phantom to the F-15 Eagle to the F-35 Lightning II, follow the Thunderbolt's template: heavy, powerful, tough, able to deliver massive firepower while protecting the pilot. The P-47 proved that in modern warfare, the fighter that survives and kills effectively matters more than the fighter that performs gracefully. At the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, a restored P-47D sits in the World War II gallery. Its placard lists the basic specifications, but next to it is a small display containing spent .50 caliber shells and a piece of gun camera film showing a Focke Wulf 190 disintegrating under fire. Below is a quote from an unnamed German pilot, taken from a 1945 interrogation report. "We laughed when we first saw them. Fat, ugly American fighters that couldn't turn, couldn't climb, couldn't fight. We stopped laughing when we realized they didn't need to turn or climb. They just pointed those 8 guns and you ceased to exist." The laughter died with our comrades. The P-47 didn't defeat us through elegance or agility. It defeated us through brutal, overwhelming, unstoppable force. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is ultimately a story about different philosophies of warfare meeting at 400 miles per hour and 25,000 feet. Germany built fighters optimized for individual combat, light, agile, deadly in the hands of skilled pilots. America built fighters optimized for industrial warfare, heavy, tough, effective even with adequately trained pilots. The Germans were right that their fighters could outturn the Thunderbolt. They were right that their pilots initially were better trained. They were right that agility mattered in traditional dogfighting. But they were catastrophically wrong about what kind of war they were fighting. The Americans didn't try to outturn German fighters, they built an aircraft that didn't need to. They created a fighter that could absorb battle damage and keep fighting. One that could engage only on favorable terms, that could be produced by the thousands and flown by well-trained but not exceptional pilots to victory. The P-47 Thunderbolt destroyed 4,449 enemy aircraft in aerial combat. Because every design decision, the armor, the guns, the engine, the structure was optimized to kill enemy fighters while keeping American pilots alive. German pilots laughed when they first saw it. Fat, slow, ugly, another American mistake. They stopped laughing when those 8 guns opened fire and their beautiful, agile, delicate fighters disintegrated under streams of 50 caliber bullets that came in walls of lead no pilot could evade and no aircraft could survive. The mockery died at 25,000 feet over Europe, drowned out by the thunder of R-2800 engines and the hammer of 8 Browning machine guns that proved a fundamental truth. In modern war, the aircraft that protects its pilot and delivers devastating firepower matters more than the aircraft that turns gracefully. The Thunderbolt didn't dance, it just won. And 3,752 German pilots paid the price for their initial mockery. With their lives, their aircraft, and their nation's dream of European dominance. By May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered, there were no Luftwaffe pilots left who still laughed at the P-47 Thunderbolt. The flying refrigerator had silenced them all. The fat American fighter that couldn't dogfight had systematically destroyed the finest air force in Europe, not through elegance or agility, but through the brutal application of American industrial might wrapped in aluminum and armed with 8 synchronized machine guns. The Germans had mocked its size. The Thunderbolt's response was written in smoke trails and falling debris across the entire European theater of operations. The sky belonged to the ugly American fighter that refused to play by European rules, refused to fight fair, and refused to die. And in that refusal lay victory.